So now that we worked on the backend and we're able to send requests to our REST API there, and with Node Express and MongoDB, we are able to store data in the database as well. It's now part to connect the frontend we also worked on with the backend. So to connect React with our backend API. Therefore, in this module, we will work on this connection. You could say this, therefore, kind of is the heart of this course, at least if we have a look at the title of the course, because now we're going to bring MERN together. Now we are going to connect React to MongoDB, Express, and Node.js. Therefore, in this module, we'll have a look at how we send HTTP requests to the backend, to the API from inside our React app, and how we use the response data we get back. We'll have a look at how we can handle errors if something goes wrong, if we're sending invalid data or something like that, and also how we can handle a loading state and show a loading spinner to our users whilst we are waiting for an action to complete or for data to load. And of course, we'll also make sure that we appropriately update the user interface once data was loaded or once some action completed. So, plenty of work to do. Let's not waste any time and instead dive right in. Now, in this module, I will switch between the backend code setup, which you can recognize by the word backend here in the top left corner, and the frontend, the React project with, well, frontend here, so that you can always quickly see where we're working on, backend and frontend. And now for the backend, I will start with one tiny adjustment in app.js, where we have our connection string to the database. There, I will now connect to a new database so that we basically start from scratch and we kind of clear all the data we created in the previous modules so that we don't have any old data lying around in the database. So here I will connect to, let's say, MERN in my connection string so that all data gets written to collections in that database. And other than that, I'm fine with the current state though, and we can dive right in and get started. Now, what does get started mean? Now, obviously, we got all our routes here on the backend to which we can send requests. And just as we started in the MongoDB sections with implementing the create methods first so that we can work with places, for example, I now also want to start implementing the connection for creating something, specifically for creating a user. Why do I want to do that? Well, because on the backend, in the end, we need a user document, so to say, to then also connect it to our place, because we have this connection set up there and we have all the code for establishing this connection, for example, in the places controller in the create place function. There, when we do create a new place, we connect the place to a creator, which we get here from our incoming request. Later, we'll change this a little bit, and which we then, of course, also look up in the database so that we really only continue if we do find a user for that provided ID. So because we have that user place connection, it makes sense to start with creating users because we need users to create places, kind of. Therefore, on the front end, of course, it's the auth page I want to start on, because there we have our auth submit handler, which in the end fires whenever we, well, authenticate. So whenever we log in or sign up. Now we'll have to tweak that logic here a little bit because I actually want to do different things depending on whether we are logging in or signing up. If we are logging in, after all, I don't want to create a new user. If we are signing up though, I do want to create a new user. In both scenarios, however, I want to send a HTTP request. In one case, I just want to send a HTTP request to the login route, and in the other case, I want to send a HTTP request to the sign up route. That's the idea here. So therefore, let's go back to the front end here, to the auth page, and let's make sure that here we don't just log in as we're currently doing it, but that instead we do send a HTTP request. For this, I will first of all convert this function here in an async function with the async keyword so that I can use async await. This is not a must do. The alternative is to use promises with then and catch, but I prefer the async await syntax here. Now, why do I need it at all? Because we will work with a promise. Because now instead of console logging any inputs, I want to send a HTTP request. And we can do that with the fetch API, which is provided by browsers in modern JavaScript. As an alternative, you could also use Axios or other third-party libraries that make sending HTTP requests simple, but here I will use this built-in API. And now this fetch function here needs a string that points at our backend. So here, I in the end want to point at /signup, or to be precise, at /API users /signup. And of course, all of that prepended with our backend host. Now, if I start my backend server here again with npm start, and of course, you find a snapshot of this latest backend state attached to this lecture. You'll just need to switch your database credentials if you're using my snapshot and use yours instead. Then, if you run npm install, you should be able to run npm start thereafter and bring up that backend server. And keep in mind that this runs on port 5000 on localhost. So here we want to send a request to HTTP localhost 5000 /API /users /signup or /login, depending on what we want to do. But we first of all need to create at least one user before we can test signing up, I guess. So let's start with this. Now, this sign up request here, if we have a look at our backend routes, should be a post request. So to configure this to be a post request, we need to pass in a second argument to fetch. And there we can configure this request. For example, we can set the method property to post, and now a post request will be sent. Now, this alone is not enough, though. We also need to set certain headers. So we'll add the headers key here and set this to an object so that we can add key value pairs here, which will represent the headers that are attached to the outgoing request. And there I want to set my content type to application JSON. Without that, our backend will not know which kind of data it receives, and our body parsing in app.js, where we parse incoming JSON data here, will not kick in correctly because it doesn't know it's getting JSON data. So let's set these headers, and of course we need to attach some data. So I want to set a body on this request, and this, and that's now important, always has to be in JSON format. Now, conveniently in the browser, we have this JSON object where we can call the stringify method, and this takes regular JavaScript data, like an array or like an object, and it will convert it to JSON. And here, in the end, I, of course, want to submit my form data. I want to add or send an object which needs to have a name key, an email key, and a password key. Why do I need to send these keys? Well, because that is what I'm expecting on the backend. If we have a look at the user's routes, we see we are validating for a name, an email, and a password. And in the user's controller, when we create a new user here in the signup function, we do extract name, email, and password. So we need to provide these 3 pieces of information here. Hence, here, I will add these 3 pieces, and as a name, I will point at form state dot inputs dot name dot value. Remember, we're having that form state here, which is coming from the use form hook, which manages our different data pieces. When we switch to sign up mode, we add a name field. If we're in login mode, we only have an email and password field. So now this is managed for us by the form hook, and therefore we can extract it here. And of course, extracting just the name is not enough. We also want to extract the email value, and we want to extract the password value. And these values should be valid when we reach the auth submit handler, because we only make this button here, the submit button, clickable if we have a valid form here, thanks to this check. Now, one thing is still not correct though. We don't always want to sign up when we reach this function. This function also gets triggered if we are in login mode. So actually here we should check if is login mode is true, And if it is true, we want to do something else. If it's not true, so if we're in sign up mode, then I want to send this request. With this adjustment, we're now making sure we only send a request to the sign up backend or to the sign up URL if we are in sign up mode. Now, fetch, of course, returns a promise. So since I'm using async here we can add a wait to wait for the response we get back. Now, this actually could also fail. So let's actually wrap this with try catch. So I'll grab all this code here and add it here into try and catch any errors we might be getting. And we'll have to do some error handling here later. For the moment, I will just console log the error. Now, one important word, this will not fail if our backend sends back an error status code, so a 400 or 500 status code. I'll come back to how we handle those a little bit later. For now, let's just wrap it like this and care about error handling later. So we got the response, and when using the fetch API, so this fetch function, the response itself has generally all the response data, but it does not yet have the parsed response body. Instead, we do parse the response body by calling response.json if it's in JSON format, which it is in our API's case, and which is in case of most APIs. This returns a new promise, so we should await this as well, and this will then be our response data, if you want to call it like this. So this will be the actual data in the response body. And if we have a look at our backend, we see what's inside the response is our created user in the end. So we got this back, we got this response data, which should be our created user data. Now for the moment, why don't we just console log this here before we then have a look at what else we could do? One important word about auth login, this should only kick in once all these steps are done, because here we are always awaiting, which means that in the end, this here is in a new then block, so to say, after all these steps completed, even though it's outside of try catch. This will only run, this auth login code will only run once we're done getting the response, parsing the response, and so on. So the order should be correct. With that, if we npm start our frontend here as well to bring up that frontend server, we should be able to send a sign up request. So let's see whether that works. Here is our frontend application. And for the moment, let's click on authenticate, switch to sign up, and test this. Here I entered max, test@test.com, and then some password and click sign up. And what we see now is actually that we get an error. And this is actually an expected error. Now, what's the problem here? Let's have a look at that in the next lecture. What's causing this error here? This error is a course error. It is an error you might see sometimes when building something like this, when communicating to an API from inside your frontend app. CORS is a security concept. It stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. And the general idea in CORS, or with this CORS concept, is that resources on a server can only be requested by requests that are coming from the same server. So for our backend, which runs on localhost 5000, the idea is that we can only request data from there from an app that also runs on localhost 5000, which our app, of course, doesn't. It runs on localhost 3000. And you might say it's both on localhost, but actually these are two totally different domains. It's like having a page on yourpage.com and thecoolbackend.com. So really two totally separate domains. Now, CORS is a security concept enforced by the browser, which is why we had no problems with Postman. But the browser enforces this, and the browser sees that here we're trying to send a request from localhost 3000 to localhost 5000, and hence it does not take the response by that server. So it's not a server-side error, it's a front-end error. It's an error in our browser because CORS is a browser security concept. To work around that, the server has to attach certain headers to the responses it sends back to the client that basically allow the client to access the resources. And then the browser automatically detects these headers and sees, okay, it's fine, you may access this, and the browser will not throw this error here. So we need to do some work on the backend, and we need to make sure we attach the right headers to our response. And a great place to do that is in the app.js file, because we will attach these headers to every response we send back on the backend. So it's not just on user routes, it's really on every response. Therefore, here, let's add a middleware before we forward the request to our specific routes here. And we register a middleware with app use, as you learned. And there I will have a regular middleware function with request, response, and next. So basically what we already learned about in previous modules. And the idea here is that we don't send back a response, but that we just add certain headers to the response so that when later a response is sent back from our more specific routes, it does have these headers attached. So here in the end, we will call next to let the request continue its journey to other middlewares. But before we call that, we want to add certain headers. And we can do that with res set header. This sets a header on the response. And there we will need to set 3 headers. The first header is access-control-allow-origin. So make sure you don't introduce a typo here. It really has to be named like this. The value, which is the second argument we pass to set header, then can be star. This basically allows us to control which domains should have access, so where the browser should allow this. We could restrict this to localhost 3000, but actually here on this API, I'm fine with opening this up to any domain. Keep in mind that this is not a general security concept, but that it's just enforced by browsers. So you can't lock down API access in general here. For example, Postman simply doesn't care about these headers. For the browser, however, this is a first step, but not the only step. It allows any domain to send requests, but it's still not enough. We also need to specify which headers these requests sent by the browser may have. Therefore, we send a new header to the responses, the access-control-allow-headers header. This controls which headers incoming requests may have so that they are handled. We can set this to star as well, but here I want to be a bit more specific. I want to allow the origin header, the x-requested-with header, the content type header. The first 2 are basically set automatically, but the content type header is one we set explicitly on the front end. The accept header, which is also set automatically by the browser. And also the authorization header, which is not set automatically by the browser, but which we will set later in the course. So we'll already configure it here. As a next step here, I will add a last header, and that's the access-control-allow-methods header. And this basically controls which HTTP methods may be used on the front end, or may be attached to incoming requests. And there I want to handle get, post, patch, delete requests. Because if we have a look at our routes, these are the type of incoming verbs we handle there. With that, if we save that, our backend restarts. And now we should be able to test this again. Let's go to authenticate again, switch to sign up, enter our data here, and click sign up, and it now works. Now you can see that here indeed we are allowing this access, and here as a response we hence got back our user data with all that entered data. Now we do still include the password here, for example, in plain text, which we might not want to submit like this. It is something we can change later once we add authentication. For the moment, this is fine. And therefore here we see that the general auth flow works. If we now check our collections on the backend, and we go to that MERN database here, we see there's a new users collection, and in there, indeed, the user I just created. So that's not looking too bad. We are able to send this request, and we made a huge step forward therefore. Of course, though, that's not all. For example, at the moment, we're not giving the user of our application any indication that we're waiting for a response, and we're also not handling errors. So we definitely want to do that as well. So we're sending a sign up request, and that's great. And we got many other requests to send. But before we do so, let's actually improve our setup here a little bit. At the moment, we're sending this request, but there are two things which I'm not liking. For one, we're not letting the user know that something is happening. Now, of course, our application here is super fast because it's all running locally on our machine. So the moment we press login or sign up here, the request gets sent and it only takes milliseconds to complete. This will probably take a bit longer once you really deployed this to a real server and the distance between the user and your code is a bit further. So it would be nice to show some loading spinner, some indicator to the user that something is happening. In addition to that, what if an error occurs? For example, if I switch to sign up here and I hack myself into a wrong form submission by inspecting my content and then manually removing the disabled attribute, now the button is enabled and any user can do that. Of course, this is not a security issue, you're only hacking yourself. But if you do that, nonetheless, you are able to, for example, enter invalid data here. So if I re-enable this, I can press sign up here. And of course, we do get back an error. We can see it here in the log. Our backend validation works. And this is the reason why we do have backend validation, by the way, because front-end validation can be disabled by the user. But still, it's not a great user experience that it still continues and we show no error message. The same, by the way, if we would try to sign up with a user who already exists. In that scenario, we also don't really handle an error. So on the backend, we got some security mechanisms in place. For signing up, we're validating input. And in the sign up controller, when we create a user, we also check whether that user already exists. But at the moment, we're not really taking advantage of this on the front end. We're not giving the user a great feedback, neither for a loading state nor for an error state. So let's change both now. And to change both, in my auth page on the front end, I in the end want to handle, well, two different states, the loading and the error state. So here we already import use state, and with that we can set up new states here in our auth function, our auth component. We have, let's say, is loading and set is loading here. And initially we're not loading, so I start in a false state. And I also have an error and let's say a set error state and function here. And initially we have no error, so this is undefined. Now we can use these two states to kind of update our UI. So here, when we start sending the request, before we send it, I of course want to set is loading to true, for example, because now I am loading and I want the UI to re-render here. Since this here is an async function and therefore all wrapped in a promise, React will also go ahead and immediately update the UI and not batch multiple state updates, for example, state updates that come later together. Instead, it will do this right away because it detects that this is asynchronous and there will be some time between this state update and potential future state updates. So here I set is loading to true. Now we can also, of course, set our error to null here and make sure it is reset, but we don't really need to do that. We should handle that differently. So let's just set is loading to true. Now, once we got our response, I of course want to set is loading to false again. And no matter if we got a response or an error, loading is definitely done. So at this point here, I want to set is loading to false. Now, if we do have an error, however, I want to call set error and set this to, let's say, error message. It's up to you what you want here, if you want to set this to a more complex object or if your error should really just be a message which you expect to get here. We can also provide a fallback in case a message property does not exist, where we just say something went wrong, please try again. We shouldn't really need that though, because on the back end we already have error handling in place, which always in the end gives us a fallback error message. Nonetheless, this doesn't hurt, so we now got this set up here, and we're either setting our error state or we're setting the loading state. Now this login thing, I only want to call off login if we didn't have an error, so only here in the try block. And therefore I actually want to set this loading to false here and here separately. Otherwise I would set it to false after we already changed the context and probably redirect it. So make sure to first clear your local state on this page before you trigger something that might change the component that's loaded. Otherwise we might be updating a state on a component which is not on the screen anymore. So now we have a loading state and we have some error state. Now, of course, we want to take advantage of these new states. And for that attached, you find two new components in the components zip file, which you can drag and drop into your components UI elements folder. That's the loading spinner and the error modal. The loading spinner also has its own CSS file, the error modal doesn't. Now, these are components which do just what the names imply. They render a loading spinner, or they utilize our existing modal. So make sure this import path fits your structure and it points at your modal component file. So they render a modal which shows an error message or a loading spinner. Now with these added back in auth page in the auth component here, let's import those components. So I will import the error modal here from shared components, UI elements, error modal, and of course do the same for the loading spinner, which I import from shared components, UI elements, loading spinner. These two new components help us use our new states we're managing, the isLoading and the error state. Let's maybe start with the isLoading state. Here, inside of this card, I will add a dynamic element where I check isLoading. And if this is true, I want to render the loading spinner, and there, important, add the as overlay prop just like this. You could set it to true, but this is not required. It's true by default if you add it like this. And this in the end will just impact how exactly this loading spinner is loaded. You can check out the loading spinner logic and CSS styles to understand what exactly this does. And with that, if we save this, let's give it a try. Let's go back here. Switch to sign up and enter some credentials here. Click on sign up and now we see a loading spinner and we are redirected. Please also note, however, that I actually got an error here. So I don't want to be redirected. I got an error and still I was redirected. Now that's something we'll have to handle in the next lecture. We're not showing our error modal, but even worse than that, we were redirected as I just said, and this is definitely not what we want. So why were we redirected when we actually had an error? Keep in mind that we only call off login here in the try block, not in the catch block. So if we have an error, we actually shouldn't be redirected because we're not triggering the login action. Well, the problem we have there is that the way the fetch API works, if you get back a 400-ish or a 500-ish error code from the backend, it still treats it as not an error, because technically you have no error. You sent a request and you got back a response. Sure, it's a response with an error status code, but that's really just the data attached to the response. Technically, there was no error. And therefore, we don't make it into the catch block if we do have a 400-ish or 500-ish response status code. Now in my application, I want to make it into the catch block though, because for me it clearly is an error if we have a 400-ish or 500-ish status code. And we can thankfully implement this. After we parsed the response body, because I want to use it even if we have an error, after all it's the response body which will include the error message. So after we parse this, I want to check if response OK. The OK property is a property that exists on the response object, and it will be true if we have a 200-ish status code. Or put in other words, if we have a 400-ish or a 500-ish status code, we'll not make it in here. So if response is not okay, we know we have a 400 or a 500 status code. And in this case, I will throw my error here. So in this case, I want to throw a new error, and I will use the default JavaScript error object and basically pass on my response data.message, which should exist here because we send back a message property on any error we generate on the backend. Since we throw an error here, this code will not execute, and instead the catch block should trigger. So if we try this again, switch to sign up, and try signing up with this existing email address again. If I click sign up, we see the spinner, of course only briefly because it's so fast, but then we stay here. And you see now this error gets logged from line 88, which is inside of the catch block. So that's great, that's the first step. But logging it like this is not enough. After all, we do manage our state here. So indeed, it would make more sense to also output some visual element here. And for that, I want to render my error modal. I want to render it next to this card and not inside of it. Therefore, since we must only have one root JSX element, I'll wrap this in a React fragment, this entire card, so that next to the card, in front of it, I can render my error modal. Now, the error modal requires an error which I feed in. And this error should be the error message, so I will just use error, and this now is our error state, which we set with setError. Keep in mind, I named this error here. This is my constant, and this is what I'm passing in on this error prop to the error modal. Inside of the error modal, I then have the logic to show this modal if the error is not empty. Well, and then I also wanna add an onClear prop here, because in my error modal, I trigger onClear if we close that modal, which opens up. It's the default modal just wrapped with some extra logic. So we should provide an onClear prop on the error modal, and there I want to execute a function which in the end resets my error. So here I will add a handle error, or actually an error handler, to stay in line with my other naming function. And the only thing I do here is I will call setError to update my error state and set it to null to basically clear it. And now here I can point at error handler. With these changes made, if we go back and we try this again, try creating a user with an existing email password, and I click sign up, now we get this error modal, and when we click OK, we handle this, we can try again. Now, if I use a new email address, which was not taken before, it therefore succeeds and we are redirected, and otherwise, as you just saw, we get this error. So now we have proper error handling and a loading state in place, and I would say our first HTTP request is looking quite decent. With that, let's also work on logging in. So let's continue our work. We have our sign up functionality. Now let's also make sure users can log in. Of course, keep in mind that at the moment we have no real login. If we check the backend code here in login, in the end what we do have is just a dummy login where we check whether that user exists and whether that password equals the one in the database. But all we send back is just a message, which of course is not really anything that would help us logging a user in for real, because besides this message, we're not doing anything that would ensure that we differentiate between logged in users and not logged in users. We'll worry about a real authentication flow later in the course. For now, let's make sure we can at least trigger this dummy route here. So on the front-end code, when we are in login mode, I basically want to replicate this functionality, which means we can actually move setIsLoading out of the if block and always set this no matter which branch we trigger. And then we can grab this try catch block here and move that into isLogin mode as well, so into this first if branch. We could also wrap the entire if statement with try catch if we wanted to. I will separate it here so that we can differentiate the two different pieces more clearly. So now we're sending this request, and of course now we're sending this to /login here, not to /signup. This is important because /login is the route we have here on the backend, /login. So this is the request. It's still a post request. It still contains JSON data, and it still contains some attached data, however, no longer a name, instead just email and password. Because when we're in login mode, we only have these two pieces of data. Then we parse the response. We check whether we have a 400-ish or 500-ish error code. And otherwise, we continue. Actually, we don't need to log the response data anymore. We certainly do want to log the user here in here if we succeeded, though. Otherwise, we show the error. I can also remove this console log here, by the way. So generally, this looks good. If we now save this, let's give it a try. Let's go to Authenticate and try logging in with a valid user. So this is the correct email I used before and my correct password. And if I click Login, it spins and this looks good. Now if we go back here, I'll try an invalid password now. And it spins and I got invalid credentials, could not log you in. If I enter, let's say, invalid email and a valid or invalid password, doesn't matter because the email doesn't exist, I also get an error. So this looks good to me. As soon as I enter valid data here, I am redirected, and I would say we got login down therefore. We might be able to refactor some code though, because we get a lot of code duplication here. We're sending our request here, and all this state management here really is duplicated. Now, for the moment, I'll leave it like this, because the problem becomes clearer as soon as we also start sending requests on a different page, which I'll do now. I now also want to send a request here on the users page, because there we need a list of users, and therefore now it's time to fetch such a list of users there. So we need a list of users here on the users page instead of our dummy users. So we'll actually get rid of the dummy users here. And instead here, I want to send a HTTP request. And I want to send that request whenever this page loads. And that's a difference, of course, to the auth page. There we send the request in a function when we click the button. Now I want to do this when this page loads. Hence, we could, of course, send a fetch request here, right inside of our component function. And as soon as this component renders, we send the request, right? The problem is, we would also always send this request whenever the component re-renders, which it most likely does once we got the response data and we change something on the page. So we would actually create an infinite loop. To work around that, we can use a React hook, the use effect hook here. The use effect hook allows us to run certain code only when certain dependencies change. The code that runs is defined in the function, which is our first argument. The second argument is an array of dependencies, so of data that needs to change for this to rerun. And if this is empty, it means it will never rerun. It will only run once, which is exactly what I want here. So now inside of this only once running useEffect function, we can send our request to http localhost 5000/API/users. And if we check our backend and we check the users routes there, we see it's just /users. Keep in mind, we only reach this file if we're on API/users here. So it's just /users, which triggers this function, which is the function I want to trigger. And in this function, in the getUsers function, in the end, we return a list of users. So I want to send a request there. It should be a GET request. Hence, we don't need to configure this to send a POST request or anything like that. We also don't need to add a content type header because we're not attaching any data. We're not attaching any content to the outgoing request. And we also, therefore, don't need to attach any body. So this request is good like this. Now, it does yield a promise, so we can use then here or async await. Now, here's one important rule. Don't turn this function here into an async function. You could technically do that and it would work, but it's not good code. useEffect doesn't want a function here which returns a promise. And any async function, so any function where you add async, will automatically and always return a promise. So don't do that. It's not good code. It goes against what useEffect expects here. So instead, you can create a IFI, so an immediately executing function. I will name it send request here. This is now a function which in the end has this fetch command in it. This now can use async, and it will then execute this function right away here in the end. So this is just a pattern which I would recommend if you want to use async await, because using async here is not recommended and not really wanted. So now we can await our response here. And then, of course, we can get the response data by awaiting response.json. And now we want to use the response data. And that's also a difference to before. In the auth component, I didn't care about the response data in the success case. I just called auth login. Now here I do care about the response data. So we actually still want to manage the loading and the error state here, but I also want to manage my response data. So we can again use state hook here and set up some states in this component. We got the isLoading state, which we set with setIsLoading, which initially is false. We got the error state and setError, of course, initially undefined. And we got the, let's say, data state, or actually loaded users maybe, since we know that this is what we'll have here, and set loaded users. And this initially is also undefined, let's say. And now here, we got the response data. Once we got that, I want to call set loaded users and set this equal to response data. And now let's have a look at the backend and see what exactly we get back. We get back an object which has a user's key, and that user's key will be an array of users. So in our response, we should have that user's key. So here I want to set my loaded users, which should be an array, equal to response data.users. I also will set isLoading to false here, because I want to set it to true right before we send the request. Here, set it to true. We also might have an error, so we can use try catch again, move all of that into try, and then catch errors here. And then in here, we can therefore also set isLoading to false, but I also want to set my error to error.message. And just as before, we don't get an error by default if we have a 400-ish or 500-ish status code. So I will check if the response is not okay, so if we have such a code, in which case I throw my own error here. Response data.message. And then we'll still make it into this catch block. We could now also move setIsLoading after try catch, so that this only runs no matter if we do have an error or not. Here in the catch block, we then just update the error state, otherwise we update setLoaded users. Now I will also add a function, error handler, just as before, where I will call setError and reset this. And now we can add the error modal and the loading state, and of course also then make sure we use our loaded users. So let's first of all import some extra component here. Let's import the error modal from the shared folder, and there from components, UI elements, error modal. And let's repeat this for the loading spinner, this other component we have in there. With both imported, let's go down to our JSX code. And here, items which I pass in should be my loaded users now. But besides that, I will use React fragment because I want to have multiple top-level JSX elements here, which only works with React fragment around them. Because of course I also want my error modal here. And the error I pass in is the error state we're managing. OnClear points at the error handler. And besides the error modal, I also want to show a loading spinner. So dynamically I'll check if isLoading is true. And if it is, I will actually add a div here with a class name of center. That's a globally defined CSS rule. And in there, I want to output my loading spinner to have a full screen loading spinner. With all of that, let's see whether that works. If we save that, we get an error here. Cannot read property length of undefined. Now this error makes sense for two reasons. For one, it makes sense because we render a users list all the time. That includes the initial rendering of this component. So before this request was sent and before we got back a response. Loaded users initially is just undefined. And undefined doesn't have a places property, and therefore there is no way for us to render anything. So we should actually only render the users list here if we're not loading and if we got loaded users. Then I want to render this users list so that we don't render this if loaded users is undefined. With that, this looks way better. Now, we still don't output places correctly, and you see I picked a really cool picture here for my avatar. But besides that, you see the number of places is incorrect. There is no number shown at all. The reason for that is that the places we get back now on our loaded users is actually an array of places. In the users list component, we expect places to actually be, well, the number of places itself. So actually, since places now is an array, we just need to change this and set place count equal to user.places.length. And with that, if we save it, we see 0 places. So now we can click on a user and we're taken to that user's page, but of course, we can't load any places because at the moment we have no places. So we want to make sure that now when we are logged in, we can also create new places. However, before we do that, we might want to reorganize our HTTP request sending code a bit because, as I mentioned before, we have a lot of duplication. Managing all the loading and error state is basically always the same. The same is true for extracting the data and checking the response status. And I don't want to repeat that in every component which needs to send a request. This screams for a custom hook. And hence, we will create one. A custom hook that sends requests and manages all the related state. So let's create a custom HTTP hook which handles all this data parsing, response status code checking, and state management logic, so that we just have a function, let's say, which we can call, which then sends a request and which then updates all its state behind the scenes automatically. For that, in the hooks folder, in our shared folder, I'll add a new file, and that is the http-hook.js file, which should have this HTTP hook I want to create. So in there, I will export a function. Use HTTP client sounds like a fitting name to me. And this function here will then, well, do all that stuff we do manually in each component behind the scenes for us. Now it should be named use something to fulfill this rule of hooks using use at the beginning. And we now need to import some things from React, of course. We'll definitely use state because we need to manage the loading and error state here so that in the components that use our custom hook, we got that state managed automatically. Now, what do we want to do inside of this use HTTP client hook? Now, I would say we certainly want to manage our loading and error state in there. So I want to copy that and move that into my HTTP hook. Then in here, I want to have a function, maybe we name it send request, because that is what I want to do there, which in the end should do just that. It should send a request. Now, of course, this function needs to be configurable. We need a URL there to which we want to send a request, the request method, which by default could be get, the request data, so the body, let's maybe name it body therefore, which by default will be null, headers, which by default will be an empty object, not null, but an empty object, that's important. And yeah, that looks good to me. Now inside of send request, we can then call fetch and send it to a URL and pass this configuration object in. In this object, we want to set the method to the method key we're getting here, which is get by default, which is fine if we set it, but which could be post and so on. And I'll use the shortcut here where we don't write this, but let JavaScript expand this. We want to set the body and our headers. With this, we have a reusable function, which thus far only wraps fetch though, right? In the end, we just forward all the parameters here to fetch. So right now, we have no real benefit of using this. Well, for one, of course, this is an async function now. So let's use await here. And now we can do all that data extraction logic in here. So if we go back to the auth page, all that logic we're doing in here, where we get the response data and check the response status code, we can do that in here now. We extract the response data and then we throw an error if we have a 400-ish or 500-ish response code. So now we're doing this in our custom hook and in this function there as well. Now I will also wrap this now with try catch here, of course, inside of my hook, like this, so that in here I can set my error to error message if we got an error. I also want to manage the loading state here, of course. So here, before we try this, I will set is loading to true, and I will set is loading to false once we're done. Now, if we stay in the success case, so if we make it past this if check, I just want to return the response data so that the component which uses our hook and uses this function can handle the data, because we need the data in that component. So here I will return response data then. We could also manage some data state in here in the use HTTP client hook, but I don't want to do that. I just want to return it. Now this hook should return is loading an error and send request so that the component where we use this hook has access to these pieces of information and to this function. So in the end here, at the end of my custom hook, I will return, let's say, an array, or actually maybe an object. And there I want to return is loading, and we could write is loading like this, or again use the shortcut, return my error and the send request function. Now, one important note about send request: to avoid infinite loops, I will wrap it with use callback so that this function never gets recreated when the component that uses this hook re-renders. This function has no specific dependencies, so I add an empty array as a second argument to use callback. But now we ensure, well, that this function, as I said, never gets recreated, and we never have inefficient re-render cycles or infinite loops at worst. This can now be our HTTP client here. One additional thing I want to add here, though, is one other function inside of my hook, the, let's say, clear error function, which will call set error and set this to null. And I want to expose that as well here in the object I return, so that the components which use my hook also can call this function. And now there is one last piece I want to add to this hook, which we didn't really take care about before. What if a request is on its way and we then switch the page? Then we would get an error, right? If I save this, for example, here, I don't use the hook yet, but we have our other logic, and there the same problem applies. And now here, I go to all users and authenticate, then enter my data here, and press this and go back immediately. If I would do this super fast, and unfortunately here it loads too fast, then we might get an error because we're trying to update our state on a component that's not on the screen anymore. In such a case, I actually want to cancel my ongoing HTTP request. To do that, I will create a new constant here in the custom hook, active HTTP requests, which is an array, and which actually is not an array like this, but instead I'll use the useRef hook, which is built into React, to turn this into a reference. A reference here in the end is just a piece of data which will not change, or in this case, which will not be reinitialized when this function runs again. And this function does run again whenever the component which uses this hook re-renders. So now this will basically store data across re-render cycles, you could say. So I got active HTTP requests here, and I want to add an active HTTP request once we send a request. So effectively here, right after I set is loading to true, so before I send my request, I will create a HTTP abort controller with new abort controller. This is an API supported in modern browsers, and I will add this to my active HTTP requests. So here to .current, use ref always wraps the data you store in it in an object which has a current property. So this current property holds this array, which doesn't change across re-render cycles. To this, I will push the abort controller. I'm not managing this as state. For a state, React would also manage it to survive re-render cycles because I don't want to update the UI when I change this data. This is just some behind-the-scenes data I'm managing here. So I'm storing such an abort controller here. Again, abort controller is a functionality built into modern browsers. And we can assign an abort controller to a request, basically. So here, when we send a request with fetch, we can add a signal property to the configuration object and point at our created abort controller. And there at .signal. This basically links this abort controller to this request. And now we can use this abort controller to cancel this connected request. For this, I will use the useEffect hook here, because useEffect can not just be used to run some logic whenever a component re-renders, but also to clean up or to run some cleanup logic when a component unmounts. And for that, let's say here at the bottom, I will call useEffect here. And my second argument is an empty array. The first argument is a function. And therefore, this only runs when a component mounts. But in this first function, when you return a function, so you return a function in this first function, then this returned function is executed as a cleanup function before the next time useEffect runs again, or also when the component that uses useEffect, so in our case, the component that uses our custom hook, unmounts. So in this cleanup function here, I can then have a look at my active HTTP requests.current property, which is an array of abort controllers in the end. And then with for each, I can go through all these abort controllers, and on every abort controller, I can call abort. And the request to which it is linked will therefore be aborted then. And now that warning which I get here that the value in current will likely have changed by the time this cleanup runs, that is fine for me. I want it to reflect the latest state, so the changed state. I want to go through all abort controllers we registered up to this point. So this is really just some logic added here to make sure that we never continue with a request that is on its way out if we then switch away from the component that triggered the request. This is our finished HTTP hook. Let's now use it in the components we already have. For example, the auth component. To use this newly created custom HTTP hook, in the auth page component here, I'll replace my existing logic to send a request here with the logic in my custom hook. So here, first of all, we can import this hook. We import use HTTP client from shared hooks HTTP hook. And then here we have to call use HTTP client, not when we want to send a request, but initially in this component, because keep in mind, this custom hook creates everything we need to send a request and then returns us, for example, a pointer at this send request function. And this is then the function we need to call to really send a request. So we can get rid of isLoading and the error state here, because this is now managed inside of the hook, and instead call use HTTP client like this. And then this returns us some data, so we can use object destructuring here to, for example, get access to isLoading, to the error, and also to send request, which is very important. Also to clear error, which we need to, well, clear an error. Now with that, if we scroll down, we got a couple of errors. Set isLoading does not exist anymore, and we don't need it anymore. It will be done all inside of the send request function, which is managed in our own hook. And instead of using fetch here, I will now call send request, pass my URL, but then actually not such an object here, but as a second argument, the HTTP method. So just post as a string as a second argument. The third argument, if we have a look at send request, should then actually be the body. So back in the auth component, let's grab this piece of data here and add this as a third argument here after post. And fourth argument then is our headers object. This now sends a valid request, hopefully, and send request also returns a promise. This, however, then already has our response data, and we don't need to manually parse it or check for the 400-ish status code. That is already done inside of our hook. Therefore, we don't set is loading here, we don't set it here, and in the catch block, we also don't need to set an error in the end because we're doing try catch already in our custom hook. So we don't need to do any try catching here at all. We can get rid of this because everything will be handled by the custom hook. Here, we will just get back our response data in the end, or undefined if we do have an error. Now I don't care about the response data in this specific component, so I can actually just await and then log in thereafter. Now we have to be careful though with this logic. In the HTTP hook, I said we do have try catch, and we do, but in the catch block here, we're not returning any response. Instead, we're just doing nothing, which means automatically undefined gets returned. Hence, at the moment, if we do have an error in here, we'll actually still make it to this line here, which I don't want, of course. So a little improvement here actually should be that if we do have an error, yes, we set our error, but we then also throw the error again so that the component that uses our hook has a chance of knowing that something went wrong. And therefore, set is loading should be set here, and also here in the success case before we return the response data. So now I am again throwing an error here in the custom hook, in the function there. And so in our component, we want to re-add try catch just to make sure that we don't always call auth login. So let's move that in here, catch any error here in the catch block, and call auth login only in the try block, so if we get no error. In the catch block, we do have an error, and well, here I don't need to do much with it though. We can log it, we can ignore it, because in the end, here in the catch block, I don't need to handle the error. We're doing all of that. We're setting our error state and so on, all in our custom hook. So this can be an empty catch block in the end. Alternatively, you could not use try catch here and use the good old then method on the promise instead and just omit a catch method. Now, similar logic for our other request here. There, I don't care about the response, but I want to send a request here. It is a post request, and the data is this data here. So I will pass this as a third argument, and then these headers as a fourth argument, just like this. That's now send request there. It is in try catch to handle any errors we're getting. We don't need to do anything of that here though. We just need to continue if we have no error, or do nothing if we do have an error. And in the error handler, we want to call clear error, this function we get from our custom hook, or we get rid of the error handler altogether, and in onClear, we just point at clear error, which is this function coming from our own hook. And with that, let's give it a try. Let's save that, go to authenticate, and maybe try logging in here. If I do that, see the spinner, and I get an error here. I got an error that abort controller is not a function. That makes sense because I do have this abort controller set up in the custom hook, but at the moment I never remove an abort controller from my array of abort controllers if a request completes. That's a little oversight from my side. Of course, we should do that. Once we have a response, we know that the request completed. So once we're here, after we parse the response body. So here I then want to go to my active HTTP requests and set current equal to active HTTP requests.current and filter out this specific controller that was responsible for this specific request. So here I want to filter all my request controllers and remove the request controller which I used for this request, which I do with this logic. This keeps every controller except for the controller which was used in this request. With that, we're not having any old request controller, which we then would try to use to cancel a request which is not on its way anymore. But in addition, the error actually also, of course, occurred because here I have abort controller.abort controller. The function is just named abort though. So we got an error because I was calling a function that doesn't exist, but this call shouldn't have happened in the first place, which is why adding this logic here also is important. We want to clear the abort controllers that belong to the request which just completed. But of course, we also want to fix this error down there and make sure I use abort and not abort controller as a function name or as a method name. So with this change now, we make sure we don't try to cancel a request which already completed. And therefore, if we test this again here, this looks way better. Now, let's also try signing up here. And let's first of all try this with credentials where we should get an error. This works. If I use valid credentials, this also works. And if I try signing up with invalid data, logging in with invalid data, I get an error, and I only continue if I have valid inputs. So this is looking good to me. It looks like our custom hook is doing its job, and with that, we can continue and we can use this custom hook in our users component as well. Definitely feel free to try to implement it there on your own first. In the next lecture, we'll do it together. So let's use our custom HTTP hook in the users component. For that, first of all, we need to import it, of course. Import use HTTP client from shared hooks HTTP hook. Then, just as before, we can get rid of these states, not of loaded users. I do want to manage this here in this component. So I will call use HTTP client here. And what we get back, just as before, is an object which we can destructure. There we'll have the isLoading state, our potential error state. We'll then also have our send request function there and the clear error function. Now here I already got send request as a name. And to avoid duplication, I'll name this here fetch users and therefore call fetch users here, of course. So a little adjustment in the use effect function. Then in here, we can get rid of set is loading. And then here, I want to have try catch, of course, but I will await send request. So this function that comes from my custom hook. This needs our URL and actually nothing else because it is configured to, as a default, send a GET request, not add any body, and not add any special headers. So this is just fine as it is. We don't need to do that parsing as you learned. However, of course, what I get back here is my response data now because we do that parsing in the send request function in our custom hook. And therefore here we can set our loaded users. If we have an error, we don't need to do anything here. And I will remove set is loading here. Now you see, useEffect complains here about a missing dependency because now indeed send request is a dependency of useEffect. I used the send request function in there and the send request function is coming from outside the effect. That's why it is important to have send request be wrapped and use callback here in the custom hook. Because if this would not be wrapped in use callback, it would be recreated whenever the hook reruns. And the hook reruns whenever the component that uses the hook reruns, because there we call use HTTP client, and it is just a regular JavaScript function after all, so of course it executes again. And if this reruns and gives us a new send request object, even with the same logic in the function, it's technically a new object, useEffect would fire again, send a new request, and we would have an infinite loop. So use callback around send request in our custom hook is super important. With that, we can correctly specify it as a dependency here, as we should, and we are sending our request. Now we can get rid of the error handler and just point at clear error here on the onClear prop. And with that, we should be good. If I now reload, you see, this seems to work. If I reload, we're fetching the users. Now let's also see if we correctly get an error here. If I, for example, sent this to an invalid URL where I removed the S at the end, and I get an error, could not find this route. So this works. Of course, our application is broken now, but this clearly also is an error we should catch as a developer during development. So with that, it works again. This is looking pretty decent to me. We're using our custom hook here. And with the custom hook added now and being used in all our user-related routes, it's now finally time to make sure that if we are authenticated, we actually also are able to create a new place here and send a request to the appropriate backend route there as well. So let's continue working on our connection between frontend and backend, and let's now focus on adding places. That's something which is missing right now, which of course should work too. So in the frontend, under places, pages, new place.js, of course I want to send a request here in the place submit handler instead of console logging this here. Now that shouldn't be too hard. We can import our custom hook. So we import use HTTP client from the shared folder, the hooks folder, the HTTP hook file, and then just as before, execute this here in this new place component. Use object destructuring to get the interesting pieces out of it, like is loading, error, send request, and of course clear error. And now we can use all of that here. So for example, here once we submitted the place, I want to send my request, of course. The URL here is http localhost 5000/API/places. And then let's check our backend. Here under places routes, we see for creating a new place, it's really just / nothing thereafter. It is a post request as we just saw on the backend. And for the data which is attached, it has to be JSON data here. So I'll stringify this and pass in an object which needs to have a title, needs to have a description, needs to have an address, and also important on the places controller in the create place function, we see we also try to extract the creator, so the ID of the user who is responsible for this place. So we should provide all that information here. Title, of course, here is form state inputs.title.value, because on this form we are managing title, description, and address. So we can also copy this to also pass on the description from form state inputs description, and then here the address from form state inputs address. Now for the creator, we have a problem. At the moment, we're not really managing the user ID here on the front end in a central place. Now with the help of our auth context, we could actually do that. We're currently just managing is logged in here. We could also manage a user ID here, which initially, let's say, is null, which we then want to send once a user is logged in. So here in app.js, where we do manage the data for our auth context, we could manage user ID as a new state and set user ID here. On login, on this login function, we could expect the user ID, the UID as an argument, and then call set user ID here and set it to that user ID. And when we log out, we reset it and set user ID back to null. And then we feed that user ID back into our context. So down there, where we set the value, we now also set user ID, and we set it to the user ID state we're managing here. Now, actually, we could wire this all up and go to the auth page. And there, when we call login, we want to forward that ID we get back. So here from send request, we do actually get back response data, both for logging in and for signing up. And if we have a brief look at the backend again, we see the data which we do get back there in sign up, for example, is our created user here. And the same for logging in. There we also, in the end, can return our user. At the moment, I'm just returning a message here, but I can return existing user to object getters true here and map that to a user property. With this, we return the user there as well. And on that user object, we of course can get the ID. So we can save this on the backend. And on the front end, response data now has the ID. So on response data, we can now access a certain key And for that, let's go back to the backend real quick again. For logging in, it's the user key which holds our user. For signing up, it's the same. So we access .user here, .id, and that should be our user ID. We can do that both for signing up and for logging in. And now we should actually manage that ID globally in our frontend. And now back on new place, creator is actually the ID of the user, which we can now get from our auth context. So there we just need to import use context from React and import auth context from this file here. So import auth context from shared context auth context. And then in here, simply get access to this by using our auth context. This sets up a listener to our context here in the new place component. And on this auth object, we can now retrieve the user ID. That's the idea, at least. So here we can point at auth user ID and attach this to the outgoing request as well. Now let's add async in front of this function here so that here we can use await so that we know once this is done. I also want to wrap this with try catch so that we can continue differently in a success case than we do in an error case. So here in the error case, I don't need to do anything actually because we set the error state inside of our hook. But in the success case, I later want to redirect the user to a different page. We can do this as a next step though. For the moment, let's instead take advantage of isLoading and error and clear error. And for that, I will again import components we used before. The error modal from shared components, UI elements, error modal, and also import the loading spinner from shared components, UI elements, loading spinner. And now we can use that here if we scroll down to our JSX code. And for one, wrap the form with React fragment so that we can have multiple top-level JSX elements here. Because next to the form, I want to add my error modal here and forward a potential error we might be having. And on clear, on the other hand, just as before, should point at the clear error function. And for the loading state inside of the form, I will check if we are loading. And if we are loading, I want to render the loading spinner in that as overlay mode, which I set by adding this prop. If we now save this, let's give it a try. Let's go back here and log in real quick. That hopefully sets our user ID. And I now go to add place and add a place here like the Marienplatz, a great place in Munich. And the address is Marienplatz 1 in Munich, let's say. And I click add place, I get an error. Invalid inputs passed. Please check your data. Okay, let's check the outgoing request in the network tab. There, this red request is the one which failed. And let's see, what did we attach as data? I did attach all my data here, including the creator, so that's looking good. We got that user ID as it seems. And still I got back invalid inputs passed, please check your data. So something was not liked about that data which I attached here. And yeah, I know what the problem is. It can be difficult to spot this issue though. When I send the request here in new place, I do add the URL, the method, and the body. What am I not setting here? The headers. And I said we would need to add the content type header and set it to application JSON. Otherwise, the body parser on the backend would not be able to parse that. And correctly, therefore, the backend would not find the appropriate data. So now with that added here, with this header added on the front end, let's try this again. Let's log in again, create a place here, the Marienplatz, a great place in Munich, and add this address and click add place. And now at least we get a different error. It fails, but with a different error. The message is creating place failed. Please try again. It's a 500 status code, so not a validation error. And this error now has a very tricky error source. Keep in mind that on the back end, we're working with transactions here, right? And if you're working with transactions, this on-the-fly collection creation, which normally works, won't work. So you need to make sure that you first of all create a new places collection here in your database before this operation can succeed. This is of course just a one-time task. You only do this when you set up your application for the first time. With the places collection added here, if we now click add place, this should succeed. And this is looking pretty good to me. We get back a success status code. We're not redirected because we have no logic for that, but we do get the right status code. And if we now inspect our places collection here, we should see our new place here. We see it points at a user who ends with 15E7. And if we have a look at our users, we see that's this first user. And there, if we have a look at the places array, we see that ID of the place we just added, which ends with 05616. That's this place. So storing places works. Now on the front end, I just want to make sure that if we do succeed, so here instead of this comment, we really do redirect. And that's easy to do. We can import something from React Router DOM, and that's the use history hook from React Router DOM. So it's a custom hook provided by this package, you could say. And it's very easy to use. You just execute it. Let's say here after our custom hooks, we call use history. And this gives you a so-called history object, which you can store in a constant. A constant I will here name history. The name is up to you. And you can then use this to redirect, because this history object has a push and a replace method, for example, which allows you to go to a new page by adding it on the stack or by replacing the current page. And here I want to allow the user to go back after the navigation, so I will push. And I will push the user to /nothing, so to the starting page. With that, if we save all of that and we create another place here in our application, we first of all need to log in. Later, we will ensure that users stay logged in. For the moment, we'll have to re-log in. And then I will add a new place here, Empire State Building, an amazing skyscraper. And here I search for Empire State Building in New York. Let's see whether that works. If I click add place, this seems to work and we are redirected, as you can clearly tell. And now just to double check, if we reload this page here in the collections screen, we should now see two documents, and one of them is the Empire State Building with the automatically fetched location and so on. And our user with whom I logged in should now have two places at whom it points. So this is working, and with that, let's ensure that now that we can add places, we can also fetch them on a per user basis if I click on a user. And don't worry that they're all looking the same here. Later, we will add a functionality to upload your own profile picture. So for now, let's make sure that when I click on max here, I do actually fetch the actual places of that user. Of course, that is something you can try on your own first, before we then do it together in the next lecture. So let's ensure we can fetch places. As I mentioned, definitely try this on your own first if you haven't already. Otherwise, we'll now do it together. First of all, let's have a look at the backend. There we have our places routes, and we got that route which allows us to fetch a place by user ID, which is exactly what we want. Or to be precise, fetch multiple places by user ID. So there we need to send a GET request to this URL. And of course, we want to do that on the user places page. That's the page where we render our places. That's where I currently use the dummy places. I'll comment this out. You could also delete it. Actually, let's delete it to save some space, because we're not using the dummy places anymore. Instead, let's now use our custom hook here, the use HTTP client hook from shared hooks HTTP hook, and let's use that to make our HTTP request. So here I will call use HTTP client, and we get back an object which I'll destructure with the isLoading state, the error state, the send request function, and the clear error function. Then here we extract the user ID from the URL, which we definitely need. And thereafter, we want to send our request. And we want to do this only once. So again, I will use useEffect here to ensure that we send the request when this component renders, but not when it re-renders. So here, as a dependency, I will provide sendRequest, which will never be recreated because it's wrapped in useCallback. So this will never trigger this function here to re-render. And therefore, this function will only render once when this component is mounted. Now, in this component, I want to manage my loaded places here as a state now, because initially it will be empty, and I want to set it once I got data, and then this component should re-render. So it definitely should be some component state. Loaded places and set loaded places here initially is undefined. Here we can get rid of this line, therefore. And now in useEffect, I will call sendRequest, and just as before, I want to use async await, but adding async here is not really something you should do. So I will wrap this into a new function, fetch places. This now can be an async function. And in this function, I will use sendRequest from my custom hook. And I will simply call fetch places here now. So sendRequest now can be waited for, so to say, and we'll get our response data here. Now let's have a brief look at the back and what we get there. In the places controller, in get places by user ID, I in the end expect to get my user ID as part of the URL, and then I return in the end an object with a places key with my places. So back on the front end, this will have a places key, or it should have. Let's wrap it in try catch, so that we only set our loaded places here if we do have a successful response. So then I will call set loaded places and set this equal to response data.places, because that is that key we are getting on the backend, and this will be an array. So we'll set this here, and otherwise I'll not do anything. Now, the user ID here, of course, is required to send that request. So here I will set up a template literal with backticks so that we can easily inject dynamic data into this string. It, of course, starts, as it always starts, with localhost 5000/API/places. And then, per our backend API definition, it's /user. You can check the backend routes here if you're not sure. /user. And then /the actual user ID. So in my case here, /user/ and then I inject the user ID I get here out of my URL. We want to send a GET request. We need no special headers, so no other argument needs to be passed to send request. However, user ID now also needs to be added as a dependency on the useEffect function here, because, well, we do use user ID in there. But this also won't change as long as we are on the same page with the same user ID in the URL. Obviously, I want to show an error if we got one, and I also want to show a loading state. So just as before, we can import the error modal from shared components, UI elements, error modal, and repeat that step to also import our loading spinner from there. And with these two pieces imported down there, just as we did it before, I will wrap this into React fragments so that we can have multiple root level React elements, or JSX elements, I should say. And then we can render our error modal there, forward any error we might have, like this, and on clear should point at clear error. And if we're loading, I want to show a loading spinner. So if is loading is true, I want to render a div, let's say, with a class name of center to have a nicely centered loading spinner like this here. And last but not least, let's make sure we only show the places here if we are not loading and we do have loaded places. Only in that case, I want to output them. By the way, you could also add a fallback scenario for cases where you have no loaded places. With that, I don't mean that it's an empty array, but that it's undefined for whatever reason. An empty array is handled inside of place list. There we render a fallback if this is empty. So with that, if we save this, we can reload here and we see our places. Now we also see some things wrong with the URL here. I do have an image, but the source is not rendered correctly. So the source is not set correctly here because in place list, I render a place item, I forward the image, and I extract place.image URL for that. Now I'm storing this differently on the backend. If you check your collections, in places, we do have an image property, not image URL. So actually here we should retrieve .image and not image URL. If we do that and we go back, we see our images. Now this is a bit pixelish. We will later, of course, be able to upload our own images, and then we can upload proper images. Other than that, though, it works. And if we view this on a map, this is the marine plots. The image just is wrong because at the moment on the backend, we always use the same dummy image. As I said, later in this app, we'll be able to provide our own ones. Here on the Empire State Building, of course, it's a better fit. And there we point at the Empire State Building. So this is already working. We are able to load places. As a next step, I want to make sure that if I am logged in with the correct user, and I therefore see edit and delete, these two buttons work as well. And I can go to edit and then load the place correctly and edit it and save these changes to the server. And the same, of course, for deleting, that this also works. As before, your chance to try this on your own. Updating, so editing, is probably a bit more challenging. Deleting should be straightforward. In the next lectures, we'll of course do it together though. So let's make sure we can update a place. For that, when we go to update place, we want to retrieve that place by ID. And at the moment this fails because I worked with dummy places thus far, and in there we can't find a place for the logged in user or for the place ID in the URL, which we actually try to do. So this won't work. Instead, I want to fetch the place data from the backend because that is a common requirement, that you have a single page with details about some entity in your application, and you want to fetch the latest data from the backend to display it there. Now, conveniently on the backend, we have a route for this. This get route where we then trigger get place by ID in the end. So now we just need to send a request to this URL from our front end. So here I will import use HTTP client from shared hooks, HTTP hook, and just as before, initialize it here. So here I can use object destructuring thereafter, call HTTP client. And now we already have a isLoading state here. Let's get rid of that. This is now managed by our hook. So here we have isLoading, we have error, we have send request, and clear error. All the things we already worked with. Now I want to send a request when this page loads to load the latest place data. For that we need use effect, which is already imported, and we will need use state to manage our loaded place data as well. So we'll add a state here, loaded place, and set loaded place, and manage this with use state, and initially that's undefined. Then here, instead of using our dummy places, I want to use effect to send a request and fetch my data. So here in use effect, I'll have send request as a dependency, and I'll also have the place ID, which we get from the URL, as a dependency. And in that function, I now want to fetch a place here. So just as before, I'll add a fetch place function in here so that I can conveniently use async await and call fetch place immediately thereafter. And in fetch place, we can now send a request, await the response, and there we got our response data. And here, of course, we need to provide a URL on that request. The URL is http localhost 5000/API/places, and now if you verify this on the backend, /some place ID. So here we simply inject the place ID we got from the URL. This should get us a place. Of course, for whatever reason, this could fail though, so let's actually catch any errors. We don't need to handle them here though, because we do have error handling built into our custom HTTP client hook. And therefore here we just need to worry about the success case. If I got my places, I can call setLoadedPlace. And now on the backend, if we have a look at the places controller, we see that getPlaceById in the end returns an object with a place key which contains that loaded place. So here we want to set the loaded place to response data.place. So this will fetch a place. Now whenever we fetch a place, we also want to update our form data, right? Before we did this here with the identified place, now we can actually grab this setFormData call here, remove this entire use effect call down there, and instead not just set the loaded place, but actually set form data, and here use response data.place.title, response data.place.description. That just means that we should add set form data as a dependency here. Now with that, we're updating the form correctly. We're storing our loaded place. Now down there, we need to check if we got a loaded place, because if we don't, then I want to render this fallback. Otherwise, if we're loading, I'll render this. Though we can do better now, actually. We can use a loading spinner here. Make sure you add the import at the top, and you import loading spinner from shared components UI elements loading spinner. And whilst we're there already, we can import error modal from shared components UI elements error modal as well, so that we can also output errors. So now we got that imported. And if we now scroll down, we're rendering our loading spinner here if we are loading. And if we're not loading and we got a place, then here I want to return React fragment so that I can also again use my error modal here and render error modal like this, forward the error which we get, and point on clear at the clear error function. And of course, you could also, just as before, check is loading here and output a loading spinner here if you wanted to. I just also want to show this alternative of doing this in an extra if statement. Now, one extra tweak I want to apply here is I want to check if we don't have a loaded place and we're not having an error, then I want to show this fallback. Otherwise, we should make it to this block here. And if we now save this, let's give it a try. Let's authenticate here. Log in, and now click on edit, and there you saw could not find place briefly before this is loaded. However, the form is definitely not initialized correctly here, and the reason for seeing could not find a place is that I check is loading too late. I should do this before I check if we're maybe not loading anymore, but we got no place in error, so I should have this order here. But the reason for the form being empty is a different one. We're simply rendering the form too early, and therefore the input gets initialized too early. Here I want to check if we're not loading and we got a loaded place. And only in that case I will render the form. With that added, if we now save this and we log in again, go to our place here and edit it, and we're still not seeing our initial values here. Now we can fix this by changing our logic here in the form a bit more. I'm checking if we're not loading and if we have the loaded place. Now actually, we can also use that loaded place, which we know will have the initial data from the backend, to set our initial title here and set this initial validity to true therefore. And down there, we can set this to loaded place.description and setting this to true. And that should do the trick. If we now save that, we log in real quick again. We go to edit here. Now this is initialized correctly. Now briefly, you see the loading spinner there, because our data, of course, arrives super quick here in this application. And then here we have our data. Now let's make sure that we don't just load the data we want to edit, but that we actually also are able to change it and then click update place and store it on a backend. Now to store our update on the backend, we got a specific route, of course. In the places routes, we got this patch route where we just need to point at API/places/placeID, and where we then add the title and description to the body of that request. So on the front end, in update place.js in the places pages folder, we want to trigger that whenever we in the end submit this form. So here, this will now be an async function so that I can use async await in there. And then here we want to send a request. We want to send a request to the backend. Now, just as before, I will use backticks here so that we can easily inject data into this string. And we'll point at localhost 5000/API/places/ the ID of that place, which of course is place ID, the value we already have available here, which we're extracting from our frontend route, from our frontend URL. Now, this is not a default request, so we need to add a second argument where we set patch instead of the default of get. I want to add a body, and this has to be stringified data, so JSON data. And there we should have our new title, which we get from form state, inputs, title value, and the new description, which is form state, inputs, description value. And last but not least, let's also add our headers here. And there, we need to add this content type application JSON header for the backend to parse the incoming data correctly. We can then await this and wrap it in try catch to make sure that we only continue in the success case. So here I catch any potential errors, but I don't do anything with it. And then here in try, I await the response. I'm not too interested in the response actually, because I just want to redirect the user if we have a success response. So for that, from the React Router DOM package, we can import the use history hook, which we already used before, and then use it here to create such a history object, which then gives us all these functions to move the user around in the front-end navigation. And use history here after awaiting for our response. After awaiting for our response, call history, and then maybe push to /nothing. And it's up to you to which route you want to redirect. Actually, here it maybe makes more sense to redirect to the overview of places. And for that, we need the user ID, because we get to that places per user overview page by encoding the user ID in the URL. And to get that user ID, we need to tap into our context, because that is where we manage our user ID of the logged in user. And for that, we also need to import auth context from shared context auth context. And then here in update place, maybe right at the start, we can tap into this context by using use context and pointing at auth context. And now with that, we get this auth object. And when we want to redirect, we redirect at /, then the user ID, and then /nothing was it, right? If we check app.js, all places are loaded for user ID /places actually, of course. So /places at the end. With that, if we save this should actually already be all. If we go to our application and we log in real quick, and I go to my places and I added this and add exclamation marks here, a great place in Munich, definitely worth a visit. And I click update place, we see the loading spinner, and then we are redirected. So this definitely works, and you see the changes reflected here. And of course, also reflected if I reload, right? Then it's still there. We are logged out now, but it's still there. So this worked just fine, and we are now able to update places as well. So let's finish this up by now making sure we can also delete places. So the missing piece is that we can delete places, and for that, on user places, on a single place, so on such a place item actually, in the place item component, we got that delete button, and there at the moment we're just console logging deleting. Here instead I want to send a HTTP request now. So to do that, again, we import our custom hook. So the use HTTP client hook from shared hooks HTTP hook, of course. That's the hook we need. Now, just as before, we can initialize it here with object destructuring and get is loading, error, send request, and clear error. all the functionalities we used multiple times by now. And we want to send a request in the confirm delete handler now, because that is when we're sure that we want to delete. We can turn this into an async function therefore, so that we can use async await in there and call send request and send this to a specific URL, which has a dynamic segment, which is why I'm adding backticks here, or why I'm using backticks. Because if we check the backend and our places routes, we see that the place ID needs to be part of the URL. So we need to send this to localhost 5000 /API /places /the ID of the place. So here it is HTTP localhost 5000 /API /places /the ID of the place. And we get that place ID here through props. In place list, I forward the ID prop here, which points at the place ID. So in place item.js, I can just use props.id here. This sends a request, but by default a GET request. So we should change this to delete to make sure it's a delete request. We don't need to add any body or extra headers though. We can then await this and of course also wrap it in try catch to ensure that we only continue if this really succeeded. So here in catch I won't do anything. If we succeed, the question is, what do I want to do? Well, in the end I want to reload the page we're on, right? Because in the end we are on the page where we display all places. Well, if we deleted a place, I just want to make sure that we update the current page. Now in the place list component, we in the end map our list of places into place items. And we get our items here from user places in the end. And in user places, we have our loaded places. So in the end, we need to tweak the loaded places once we delete a place. So in the place item component, once we're done deleting, I will call props on delete and expect that on delete, I get a function, which in the end, therefore, is executed through that prop. So in the place list component, we have to make sure that we set the on delete prop on a place item, which is where I call this, to a function, which I expect to get from outside. So here on place list, I will also call on delete place, let's say. So I will forward this to another function I expect to get on a on delete place prop directly on this place list component. So now we need to set on delete place as a prop on the place list here. On delete place, and now here in user places, which is the component I'm working in now, there I want to trigger a function. Place deleted handler maybe. And here I want to update my loaded places appropriately. So let's put place deleted handler into on delete place, and therefore in the end we forward it to on delete in the place item. And in user places, in the place delete handler, I then want to call set loaded places and update my loaded places. And I want to update them such that I filter out the place which was just deleted. For that, we can use the function form of setting a state here. So we got our previous places and I want to return the new places. And the new places are based on the previous places, but there, this is an array. I want to call the filter method to filter out a certain place. So I will go through all my places here and only keep the places where the ID is not equal to, let's say, the deleted place ID, which I expect to get as an argument here. So I expect to get this parameter here, deleted place ID, and only if the place I'm looking at in my existing array of places is not equal, I'll keep it. Because if it is equal, it's the place I want to delete. So in the new array, which I return here, it should not be included. So that I set my loaded places state to a new array where the deleted place is filtered out. Now we just have to make sure that we pass this deleted place ID to this function. And in the end, we are calling this function in place item.js here. So here we should forward props ID because that's the ID of the place which was deleted. This is the trick, hopefully. This should do the trick. Now let's still handle the loading and the error state here. And therefore, we import the error modal from shared components, UI elements, error modal, and of course import our loading spinner here from shared components, UI elements, loading spinner. And with that, if we go down there, in React fragment, we can add our error modal here. And there forward our error we might be getting and point on clear at clear error. Side note, also make sure that in confirm delete handler, you call set show confirm modal false first so that you close the confirm modal before you send that request, and maybe also open up an error modal thereafter so that we don't have multiple modals open at the same time. And to also show loading state, I'll scroll down, and here inside of my card, so on top of this place which I want to delete, I will check for is loading and then send or render my loading spinner in that overlay mode if we are loading. With that, if we save this, here are the places. Let's now log in like that. And now here, if I click delete, I can cancel, of course. But if I click delete here, you see the loading spinner and we're done. Now this here looks good to me. It seems to work. If I reload, let's see if it still is gone. It is. And if we check the database now and we refresh the places, we should only see one place. Yes, we do. And for users, if we check that, we should also see that the first user only has one connected place, so that this connection to the place was also cleared there, and the other users have no places. And this is looking good to me. It looks like our application is working and we successfully connected frontend and backend. Now, one error I just spotted in the application we built is that I forgot to change something in nav links here, where I load my places. I always point at U1, and as a result, when being logged in, if I click my places, I always get this error here. Now, therefore, we should change this, of course. This here should be bound dynamically to a string where we say something dynamic and then slash places. And the dynamic thing here is coming from the auth context and should be our user ID. So that we use the real user ID here and not that dummy user ID. So with that, if we are logging in here and I go to my places, I might not find any places for this specific user if he hasn't created any. But if we have a place, like here, a dummy place I created behind the scenes, then we do succeed. So that is an adjustment you should make. Fix that nav link to ensure that your navigation app works correctly.